Our default model is we own the methanol modules and we share the revenue with the ethanol. So it costs the ethanol plant essentially nothing to take advantage of the technology.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we welcome Jeff Bonar, CEO of carbon capture company Cap CO2 Solutions. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest on the show. Traditionally on this podcast, we like to get a bit of our guest's backstory before really getting down into the business side of things. So please, I'd love it if you could share with us a little bit of what you used to do before Cap CO2 and how you ended up in this industry.
Very good. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I have a PhD in computer science, and I've been building software for decades, actually. As you get on in probably any industry, it's less about your cutting edge technology expertise and more about how you get people to talk together and work through hard problems together. The programmers really want to do it one way. The business analysts want to do it a different way. The customer wants something else. You got to get all those people to come together on the same page. So when I wrapped up my last business, my kids said to me, you need to work on the climate. You screwed it up. You got to fix it. So that was my impetus to get involved with climate. And as you might imagine, that skill of being able to get people who don't normally talk or who think they're not aligned to find an alignment, that's very useful in the climate world. And in fact, a huge number of issues are really more about alignment of interest than they are about, what's the right technology or something like that. So that's how I got into climate. I got very excited about the opportunity of using biogenic CO2, which we'll get into, but CO2 that comes from biological sources, and using it to do something useful. And that's kind of how I got to Cap CO2.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Now, since Cap CO2 works predominantly with ethanol plants, I was curious to learn more about low carbon ethanol and its importance in today's world. I know that it also has to do with things like green methanol and sustainable aviation fuel. So please do tell us more about that.
Okay, great. Let's take it a piece at a time. So when you say low carbon anything, what you're referring to is the total CO2 that was emitted to make and use that thing. So, whatever, a low carbon plastic bag is one that doesn't emit as much CO2 as a regular plastic bag. I mean, that's what it means. So low carbon ethanol means that that there is less CO2 emitted as part of making that ethanol than would be traditional in the ethanol industry. And there's a number of pathways to reducing the carbon. One thing is you can use more sustainable agriculture techniques. So if you use cover crops and you use non-chemical fertilizers, but natural fertilizers. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not going to get into that in detail, but that's part of it. But the big issue for ethanol is that an ethanol plant, it's fermentation. You're taking a product that has a lot of sugar in it, you're fermenting it down, and instead of making wine or whiskey or beer, you're making ethanol for use in fuels. And when you do that, you emit a lot of CO2. The process of fermenting the corn emits lots of CO2. And right now, ethanol plants purify that CO2. They extract every bit of ethanol because they don't want to waste the ethanol. And they emit very pure, clean CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's how they get rid of the CO2. So that CO2, if you could capture it and do something useful with it, that becomes an opportunity to make it low carbon ethanol. So chemically, it's not any different. What's different is how you attend to the CO2 emissions that are part of the making of the ethanol. So we have a very attractive thing to do with that CO2. Let me introduce one more piece of the overall analysis here. There are industries that we're just not going to be able to electrify. You could imagine, at least in some places, of replacing automobiles with electric automobiles, gas automobiles with electric automobiles. But there are certain places where it's just not going to work. On aircraft, no one has figured out anything close to a practical electric airplane. No one has figured out how to take giant ocean-going tanker ships and electrify them. So you need fuels that, when they're burnt, emit no new CO2. And so what we're doing with the CO2 that comes from the ethanol plant is we're making those green fuels. Let's call them generically green fuels. Green methanol is the simplest possible green fuel, and it turns out to be what the shipping industry has standardized on as their future fuel. So over the next 15 to 30 years, the shipping industry will replace their fossil fuel-based ships with green methanol ships. And by doing that, why does that help? Well, how does that help? Well, first of all, when you spill methanol, it just dissipates. Within 5 or 10 minutes, you have no pollutants, no problems, no issues. So the whole issue of oil spills goes away. But just as important for the idea of low carbon ethanol, the CO2 that comes from an ethanol plant was captured by plants, mostly corn plants. And those corn plants, if they rot or if the corn gets eaten by people, that CO2 is going to go back in the atmosphere or eaten by cattle. If you can do something useful with that CO2, like, for example, turn it into a green fuel, and then do something useful with it, you haven't added any new CO2. So you've gotten a valuable green fuel without adding any new CO2. If you burn fossil fuel, you're going to add a lot of new CO2. But if you use CO2 that came from a biological source like corn, then it adds no new CO2 to the atmosphere. So the basic idea is we take an ethanol plant, take their CO2 and turn it into green methanol. That methanol gets used as a fuel, most likely as a fuel. And the ethanol is now low carbon because you've done something useful with the CO2. And the methanol is also low carbon because of where it came from, that you took CO2 that it was otherwise going to go back in the atmosphere directly. So it's a little complicated, and there's kind of two pathways we're keeping track of, the ethanol pathway and the methanol pathway. But by turning the CO2 into green methanol, you've got a win for both sides. And the gold standard for measuring carbon intensity, the carbon footprint, is called the GREET model. And we've had GREET modeling done on our green methanol process, and we reduced the carbon intensity by 25 points. And to give you a sense of that, what that means, the typical ethanol plant is somewhere between 55 and 75 points for their ethanol. So, above 50, it's not considered low carbon ethanol. But we can drop that carbon intensity by 25 points, almost in every case, getting it below 50. So That was a lot of speaking. Do you have questions?
No, I'm listening very closely. Yes, I do have questions actually. Less so probably perhaps about the technology of it, instead more so about the industry at large. Like, how big is the green methanol industry currently?
Well, the green methanol, it's more an opportunity than an industry right now. Maersk is the world's largest shipping company. They are leading the transition in the shipping industry to green methanol, converting their ships from fossil to green methanol. And they will need roughly, per large ocean-going vessel, they will need roughly the output from one ethanol plant for every ship. And right now, there's enough methanol, green methanol in the world to power 2 ships for a year. So it's a real problem. They are hell-bent on finding more sources of green methanol. So that's a huge opportunity for the ethanol industry. We could, who knows exactly how it'll play out, but in theory, Maersk could buy almost all the green methanol that the ethanol industry could produce.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's just Maersk. It doesn't count the many other companies that are also looking for green methanol.
So in that line of thought, since green methanol is a way of doing away with excess CO2, would you say that it's a viable alternative to carbon pipelines?
Oh, definitely. In fact, I think it's if I do say so myself, I think it's a much smarter alternative than carbon pipelines. You're actually making money. You're taking the CO2, doing something useful with it, and making money off of that. Why would you not do something useful with it versus, spend billions of dollars to pipe it somewhere and hopefully bury it? The pipelines are, again, without getting into all the complexities here, the pipelines are a pretty big bet that, can we really spend, find $8 billion? Will those pipelines really work? And once you bury it, does it really stay underground? And I'll raise another concern. At least in North Dakota, they're kind of hell-bent on using that CO2 to drill more oil with. They call it enhanced oil recovery, EOR. If you're really using it to drill more oil, does that really count? So there you go. That's my critique of the pipeline plan.
Okay, and thank you so much for getting into the details of the green methanol production. I wanted to shift our focus back onto Cap CO2. I know that the company positions itself as having cheaper and more efficient technology than the competition, I guess, but what makes that possible?
Sure. Methanol is one of I think it's the number 2 chemical commodity in the world. So methanol gets used for, hundreds of things, plastics, insulation. BMW estimates, for example, that 1 ton of methanol goes into every automobile. So including all the plastics, including the seat covers are made out of methanol. Again, many, many different things get made out of methanol. So BMW estimates it's 1 ton of methanol in every automobile. Conventional methanol, there are big conventional methanol plants. They cost $200 million. They take up many acres. It's a big, complicated chemical plant that, if you think of an oil refinery, that's sort of what a methanol plant looks like. The reason they're so big and complicated is that conventional methanol technology requires 8 passes. So each pass extracts about, between 10 and 15% of the methanol that's possible. So you have to do it over and over and over again to get all of the methanol out. the technology we're using, which was invented by a professor at the Technical University of Delft, which is kind of the MIT of Europe. He invented a technology that allows you to do it with one pass. And because it's only one pass, the equipment's much more compact. It operates much quicker. There's a lot less fiddling around at the edges you have to do to get it all to work. And so that's the technology we're using. We have the exclusive license in the US to use that technology. So that's how we're doing it. Oh, and one more piece that's important is it's much more compact. So we can deliver the technology in what we call a methanol module, which essentially means a shipping crate, a skid, they also call it. So 40 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, that's one methanol module. And the average ethanol plant will need 8 to 10 of those. So instead of building a big complicated chemical factory, you deliver some skids to the site, hook them up, and you now are in the green methanol business. So that's part of the vision here, is that we can make it simple and repeatable and not a big custom chemical plant development.
Okay. And does Cap CO2 participate in utilizing these emissions, or is all of that just left to the ethanol plants? Like they have the technology, they can produce their own methanol, and that's done.
Our default model is we own the methanol modules and we share the revenue with the ethanol plant. And so it costs the ethanol plant essentially nothing to take advantage of the technology. We have been informed by some ethanol plants that that's not how they're going to want to do it. They want to own the equipment, and we'll work that out as well. It just depends on the economics that are most important to the ethanol.
Okay. Another question I wanted to ask you is because you're currently building the biggest green methanol network perhaps in the world, what goes into that?
Well, that's what's simple. I mean, that's the exciting part. We build these methanol modules, we deliver them on site, and we make the business arrangements to sell the green methanol. That's the network. You don't have to, it's a virtual network, as they say, because we're just taking the existing ethanol plants and upgrading them so they can do green methanol. So we don't, there's a little bit of poetry to the calling it a network, because it really is virtual. We're just delivering methanol modules to the site of ethanol plants.
Okay, understood. And since I was kind of hinted at, where does green hydrogen fit into all of this?
For it to be green methanol, it has to, essentially what methanol is doing is you take electricity and you take the energy from the electricity and you put it in the chemical bonds that make up the methanol. And then when you burn or use the methanol, you're using that energy. So you can think of green methanol as just a way to store energy. It's sort of like a battery, but it's a battery that isn't very expensive to use. It's we already know how vehicles work when you fuel them with a fuel. So it's just a very convenient way to store and transport the energy that comes from electricity. So in particular, to make the green methanol, we need a lot of energy. And for it to be green methanol, as opposed to just plain old regular methanol, that needs to be from renewable power. If we need to emit CO2, say burn fossil fuel, to get the power, then that's not going to work as green methanol. It needs to be power, it needs to be electric power that was generated without any CO2 being emitted. So solar, wind, water, geothermal, those are the most common varieties of of green power. And that's what we need. It's by far the biggest cost to making the green methanol is to use that renewable power.
Okay. So given everything we've spoken about today and your experience in the field, how do you see this industry or opportunity, as you called it, developing in the coming years?
Here's the plan. We have a pilot plant we're building in Lena, Illinois. We've got all the plans ready there. We're raising the money for that pilot plant right now. Once we have the pilot plant in place and working, we then need to start manufacturing those methanol modules. And we'll be doing that in the US. And as we make modules and scale up our ability to make those modules, we'll be able to deliver them, install them, and get them running at new ethanol plants. And we already have a number of ethanol plants interested in being number 2, 3, and 4 for sure.
Okay. And another question I have, I know that the Midwest is considered particularly special for green methanol. Can you dive into that perhaps? Why is that?
Well, it's the mother lode of clean, pure biological CO2 that there's no other source in the world. Here's where you typically get biological CO2. Wastewater treatment plants, landfills, manure treatment plants. Those are all good sources of biological CO2, but as you can imagine, they need lots of cleaning up. You can't just use that CO2 without scrubbing it in various ways. At ethanol plants, it's already pure and clean. So they're just the natural place to make green methanol. And there's a lot of ethanol plants in the Midwest. It's that simple. It's not like anything more complicated than that. The Midwest is really good at ethanol. Ethanol has been valuable. And now let's decarbonize it, and it'll continue to be valuable going forward. And in addition to producing low carbon ethanol, it can also now start producing green methanol.
Do you see Cap CO2 potentially expanding to beyond the borders of the U.S.?
I do. That's definitely possible. And I also see it expanding beyond the ethanol industry, but one thing at a time. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But
oh no, please do share if you feel comfortable to. I'm really curious as to what other industries you could potentially be looking into.
Well, there's a huge amount of your listeners and you've probably heard of renewable natural gas, RNG, which is typically made at, among other places, it's made at manure treatment facilities. Well, when you treat manure, you get 60% renewable natural gas and you get 40% dirty CO2. And you've already got a lot of equipment there and you're already building something that's useful and low carbon. Well, shouldn't we use that CO2 and make green methanol out of it? The only obstacle is that you have to clean up the CO2. So that would be a natural next step for Cap CO2.
Brilliant. That sounds like very exciting times, and it sounds like there's definitely much room for expansion ahead.
Definitely.
Jeff, thank you so much for your time and for the wealth of knowledge you've shared with us today. It was a genuine pleasure to have you on the show and to speak to you again.
Very, very good, Violet. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.